If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
On today's episode, Valerie pitched Home Alone so that we can study the middle build of stories. This 1990 film was directed by Chris Columbus from an original screenplay by John Hughes. Now, of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. And we'd love it if you could give the show a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll down to the bottom. It's that simple. All right, Valerie, what have you got for this week's movies genre?
I think it is a global worldview maturation, and the secondary genre is action. What do you think?
I absolutely agree and have the same. So it's pretty straightforward.
All right. Okay. Yep. Brand new season, brand new topic. Alrighty. So last season I talked about the beginnings and endings of stories. And this season I am discussing the middles of stories. So we know that every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that makes up the 3-act structure that we hear so much about. The beginning and the ending are actually the easiest parts of the story to write because there's so much that we have to do in them that, we end up hitting our word count pretty quickly. And when I say easy, that's a relative term. And because the beginning and the ending work together as a unit, once you've cracked one of them, you've cracked the other. But it's this middle part that's so tricky because it's one big chunk of writing and it makes up at least half of your story. Now, it's important to understand that the word act is problematic because it has so many different meanings when it comes to storytelling. I've just said that stories have a 3-act structure, beginning, middle, and end. And that is true. But then there's also 1-act plays, there's 4-act movies, 5-act TV shows. Some stories are told in 2 acts, some in 7 acts. So, what are we supposed to do with all this information? How are we supposed to make sense of it all? Well, my best advice is to come back to the basics. Regardless of terminology, every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Since the middle is so big and can cause so many problems, writers tackle it by breaking it down into smaller, more manageable pieces. Without question, in modern storytelling, the most popular for novels and films is to break the middle into either 2 or 3 parts, which are also called acts. These middle 2 or 3 acts can then be broken down even further into sequences. And that's essentially what Melanie was studying last season. That 3-act, 8-sequence structure broke the middle into 2 acts, which were then further subdivided into 2 sequences each. Hope that makes sense. And that's pretty common. So it's a common approach to modern storytelling. All right. Now, I have to make a bit of confession here. I've got to come clean about something. I have said over and over and over ad nauseum that stories do not have a formula, that they have form. And it's true, and I do believe that. And I love that about stories, actually. There's a framework that lends itself to endless artistic interpretations. However, when it comes to the middle of stories, especially what Melanie was referring to as the sequence 3 last season, when it comes to that, for me, I have to admit, there is a part of me that really wishes there was someone out there who would just give me the answers to the test. For me, this beginning part of the middle is hands down the hardest part of the story to write. I don't know why. I don't know if it's now just a mental block I have, but that for me is the hardest part of a story to write. So there is a small part of me that wishes there was a formula, because then I would know what to write without having to do the hard work of being creative and innovative and being an artist. However, there is no formula. There is no one definitive answer. I have looked high and low. Believe me, I've spent thousands of dollars on training, thousands, and I've spent countless hours studying stories, both novels and films, looking for the answer. And what I found are general guidelines about how to craft the middle of a story. Every resource I found relates to the arc plot structure only. So, in other words, single linear storylines with a single protagonist. Furthermore, all the reference books and the courses that I've found that talk specifically about how to create the middle of a story all say pretty much the same thing because, to varying degrees, they're all referencing the hero's journey. I've not yet found any reference books that specifically reference multi-plot stories or mini-plot stories or stories with more than one POV character. Now, if you know of any, please let me know on Twitter or Instagram. You can find me at Valerie_Francis. But see, here's the thing. We have to understand the arc plot structure first because everything relates to it. So if we can't write a single linear storyline with a single protagonist properly, and by properly I mean in a way that works, then we won't be able to write a nonlinear story effectively or a story with multiple protagonists effectively. Melanie, what do you think about that?
Well, what you've said reminds me of the adage, to break the rules, you need to know the rules. And Archplot teaches us the rules of storytelling so we can break them when we want to write something using a different structure. So that absolutely rings true for me as well. But I do think anti-plot stories are non-linear. That's, I think, a given. Like they fall into absurdist kind of stuff there. So that makes sense to me. But it's interesting because I don't think of multi-plot or mini-plot stories as non-linear stories. So I think they are mostly linear with some variation. So, but I haven't given that a massive amount of thought, but when you were talking, that's something that popped into my mind. As for acts, I really think that people just need to find something that works for them. If it's one principle or theory or a few theories that allow writers to move forward, then go with that. But when in trouble, go back to the basics, like you said, or the theory that you feel comfortable with and understand and go from there. The other thought I have around this is if you can't find a framework or theory that you like, then pick one or two books or stories that you like and study that like crazy. Use that as your framework or reference. Break it down into acts and sequences. Look at each scene or track the experiences of the protagonist. You won't find the answers, but you will find a framework that can help you. And finally, I know what you mean about having a formula, especially on the days when writing is hard, but I'm pleased that there isn't one because I'd hate to have to be right or wrong about storytelling. And I think that defeats the point of being creative as a human being.
Yeah, I think the linear or nonlinear timeline can apply to any of the structural forms. It's, to me, a separate but related issue. But the base form of story, what's known as the classical story form, is one that has a single protagonist and a single linear storyline. And yeah, I agree 100%. John Hughes certainly knew how to write a story that audiences would enjoy. And he's not breaking form here with Home Alone, but he knew the principles of storytelling so well that he could bend the form and still have a rock solid script. I actually, in an earlier draft of my notes here in preparing for the podcast today, talked about how John Hughes was bending the form. But I took it out because we would have had a 2-hour show. All right. I do have a lot of things to say, though, so let me get on with it. All of this stuff that Melanie and I are talking about here, about the beginnings and middles and ends and forms and all that kind of stuff, is all very interesting. But what can we learn from the middle of Home Alone? Now, when I do a study like this, I start with the most macro concepts and I work gradually, work my way toward the smaller concepts. So that's what I'm going to do here on the podcast this season. So the very first thing I do, step one, is determine the type of plot structure that's being used. In other words, is the story that I'm going to study, is it an arc plot, a multi-plot, a mini plot, or an anti-plot story? Home Alone is an arc plot story, which is the classic story structure. There's one protagonist, it's a linear timeline. Now, this makes our lives easier because this is the plot structure that all of the reference books use. Yes, there are subplots, but I'm really not focusing on those too much today. One note here, though. I've noticed that some of the lower quality reference books that are on the market, they aren't even aware that what they're talking about is an arc plot story. They aren't aware that they're referencing the hero's journey. I've even come across some texts by supposed experts who criticize the hero's journey as antiquated and misogynistic, and they call for it to be abandoned, but then they go on to talk about it for 300 pages. So when you're selecting theory books to study so that you can learn more about how to write stories, really be careful about which ones you're choosing. Be wary about the resources you're consulting. Now, yes, there is the heroine's journey, but honestly, that's a variation of the hero's journey. And it's really important that you understand that the terms hero and heroine are not gender specific, not when it comes to storytelling. So, for example, if your story has a female protagonist, it doesn't automatically follow that your story will use the heroine's journey. Okay, so that's the first step. The second step, and the second thing I want to know when I'm beginning a study of a story, especially right now in terms of middle build, is what percentage of the story the middle build takes up. And by the way, it's called build because its job is to build the tension in the story. So in Home Alone, the middle is a whopping 80% of the film. That is huge. It's massive. It starts when Kevin realizes that he's home alone. This is his cross into the extraordinary world. And it ends when his mother returns. The main plot is that of Kevin being home alone. And the subplot is his mother, Kate, trying to get back to him. All right, step 3 then. Once I've determined it's an arc plot story and the middle build is most of the story, then I look at that middle build and determine how many parts it's been broken up into. So remember that the middles of stories, that is Act 2 of this 3-act story structure, in modern stories are generally broken up into either 2 or 3 smaller parts, which are also called acts. Now, when I was co-hosting on the Story Grid Editor Roundtable podcast, I started to call these smaller parts Middle Build 1, Middle Build 2, and, where applicable, Middle Build 3, just to avoid the confusion with the term act. So I'm going to continue that here. For my money, the middle of Home Alone is broken into 3 distinct parts. Now, yes, there's an argument to be made for it being broken into 2 parts, and if that works better for you, you can certainly do the analysis that way. However, given the way they've presented the film, 3 parts makes a lot more sense to me. And why am I saying that? Well, because Kevin is home alone for 3 days, and each day is presented exactly the same way. First, we see Kevin during the day, and then we see him at night. And at the end of each segment, he has a run-in with the burglars, and these run-ins escalate. The stakes get higher, the tension increases. And embedded in this day-night structure is the subplot. We cut back to Kate, Kevin's mom, trying to get back home to him. And we even have some little bits of Marley, the neighbor who's shoveling the salt. He's even pops in there in each of these 3 days. All right, so the next step, step 4. This is when I finally drill down into the details of each middle part. And I look for different things depending on what it is I want to know. It could be the story arc or the character arc. It could be the length of that part or that segment. It could be how much world building is done in each part. Whatever it is that I'm curious about, this is where I drill down and I focus on that one particular thing. So for today, I want to see the size of each of these middle parts relative to one another. And I want to see how each part is moving the story along. So let's take a look at them one at a time. Middle build 1, the running time is about 18 and a half minutes. So it starts in the day. This is day one of Kevin home alone. And it's when Kevin wakes up and realizes that he's made his family disappear. All right, so he's still the kid that he was in the beginning hook. And he approaches this extraordinary world of freedom, of being alone, of being responsible and being in charge, the way Kevin from the beginning of Hook would. Remember, he hasn't changed yet. So in this part of the story, John Hughes is clearly establishing who this kid is in his before state. So what is that before state? When Kevin is in his before state, the experience of being totally left alone is awesome. Like there is nobody to nag him or push him around. So life is one big party. It feels to him like all his problems have vanished. He does all the things he's not allowed to do. So we see him jumping on the bed, eating popcorn in his parents' room, going through Buzz's things, eating junk food, watching the movies he's not allowed to watch, shooting the BB gun, and sledding in the house. Notice that since he's still the same kid as he was in the beginning hook, he's still afraid of the basement, he's still afraid of the movie, and he wants his mom. Hughes is also setting up things that will be paid off later in the movie here. For example, Kevin's skill with the BB gun and the dialogue and the shooting from the movie that he's not supposed to watch. Then we move into day one night, and this is when Kevin has his first encounter with the burglars, who are, of course, the villain or the antagonists of the movie. Now, typically, the first time the protagonist encounters the antagonist, he deals with it as quickly and easily as he can, and this is what happens in Home Alone. Kevin neutralizes the threat by turning on the lights, and then he hides under his parents' bed. And it works because the burglars assume the homeowners are still there, and they leave. This also marks the first shift in Kevin's character because he says, when he's lying under his parents' bed, "This is ridiculous. Only a wimp would be hiding under the bed. But I can't be a wimp. I'm the man of the house." And we also see some subplots here, as we do in the other parts as well. But for example, here in this middle build one, we see Kate, Kevin's mom. This is when she realizes that she's left Kevin home alone. Kevin declares he's not afraid anymore until the neighbor arrives, Marley, and then he begins, his famous screaming bits. Now, a little side note here, you can ask yourself why this storyline with the neighbor is even in the movie, because it would work just fine without Marley. Well, I think it's another way to highlight Kevin's character arc, because in the beginning, he's terrified of Marley. In the end, he knows and respects the man. All right, so now we're into middle build 2, and the running time here is about 15 and a half minutes. Again, it starts out, this is day 2 of Kevin Home Alone. It starts out in the daytime, and we see Kevin beginning to take action. We see a little bit of maturity kicking in. Now he's playing house, of course, because he's still mostly a kid. But that is a whole lot more than Kevin has ever done before, right? This is the kid who in the beginning hook wouldn't even attempt to pack his own suitcase. And now he's emulating his parents and what they would do had they been home. He evaluates the situation and he makes a plan to go out for supplies. He has a second encounter with the burglars on the street, and this time he knows he can't go home because they're following him, so he runs to the church for safety. Now, whereas middle build 1 Kevin was reactive, now he's starting to get a little proactive, right? He makes a plan and he says, when those guys come back, I'll be ready. The subplots that we have popped in here, Kevin is still afraid of Marley, and his fear causes him to steal a toothbrush. And poor little Kevin is so disappointed with himself. He says, well, now I'm a criminal, poor little guy. And we see his mom trying to get back to him, and she is able to get a flight back to the US, but not to Chicago. Now we move into the nighttime of day 2, and this is when Kevin has the party. He set up the party. We've got the Michael Jordan going along on the train track and all that great stuff. He makes it look like the house is rocking, and this confuses the burglars. It also means that Kevin defeats them for a second time. Now, Kevin orders a pizza, and he uses the film sound to interact with the delivery boy. He does pay for the pizza. Remember, he doesn't like being a criminal, right? He has beaten himself up for stealing the toothbrush. He finally gets his cheese pizza, but now instead of just missing his mom, he misses his whole family and he wants them all back now. Again, another side note. This party that Kevin puts together to fool the burglars, this is evidence of Kevin's gift. It's not the full expression of it. That comes later in the big climax of the whole film. And his gift was set up right in the beginning hook. There's a whole discussion between Kevin and his parents about Kevin having used the glue gun out in the garage again. And he says, well, I was making Christmas gifts with the fish hooks. So we know, and they talk about his toys too and how his aunt is stepping on his toys. So the gift is hinted at in the beginning hook. Now we see a fuller expression of it, but it's not fully realized, of course, until the next act. Now we come to Middle Bill 3, and this is 42 and a half minutes. It's big. 20 minutes of it is the climax, is the famous, I was going to say scene. It's a number of scenes where the burglars are in the house and Kevin is thwarting them at every turn. So that's 20 minutes of a roughly 90-minute movie. It's significant. So this is Middle Bill 3 is all about the third day that Kevin is home alone. This is Christmas Eve. And again, it starts in the daytime. And we see Kevin even more in control than he was in Middle Bill 2. He goes shopping again, but this time he's successful. He does, he buys the stuff that he needs. He gets laundry done. He is truly not afraid anymore. And when he's down in the basement, he even looks at the furnace and tells it to shut up. And in this part of the story, he actually talks to his neighbor, Marley, and discovers that he's actually quite a nice man. Now, the burglars return here, and Kevin uses the movie again to scare them away, and he uses firecrackers to scare them off. If you remember in Middle Build 1, when Kevin was watching the movie, he got scared and he put his hands over his eyes and he called out for his mom. Here in Middle Bill 3, he's lip syncing the dialogue, right? This is a totally different Kevin than we saw at the beginning of the movie. He goes and cuts down a tree himself. He puts it up and he sees the burglars in the decorations. Now the burglars realize that Kevin is home alone. Kevin overhears their plan to come and rob the house later that night, and he still wants his mom. I really love this part about Kevin, that yes, he matures and he grows, but whereas in the beginning hook, he didn't appreciate his family or his mother, because he's very rude to his mother. As the story moves along, he wants his mom more and more, and he appreciates his whole family more and more. Alrighty, so then we move into the nighttime, right? And of course, the subplots here, right? This is where Kevin speaks with Marley and talks about his son, and we see his mom taking the drive with the Kenosha Kickers. And she's driving to Chicago. So those are the subplots that are happening here. Then we move into the nighttime of Christmas Eve. Kevin has a wish for Santa. He goes to the church and he says, this is my house. I have to defend it. And then we get the big plan. He's even got floor plans. I don't know when he made those, but the whole big thing that we think of when we think of Home Alone, this all happens here. And it's, like I said, it's 20 minutes. So you can see how each part of the middle build is increasing the tension in the story, and it's escalating the stakes. If we look just at the way Kevin is dealing with the burglars, first he deals with them by simply turning on the house lights. Then he makes it look like there's a party going on. And finally, he mounts a direct attack because he's forced to. Whew, okay, that's enough out of me, Melanie. I am really curious to hear what you have to say about subtext this week. What did you learn from Home Alone?
Well, I have to confess that this is the first time I've watched Home Alone as a whole movie. I've obviously seen bits, but I've never seen the whole movie before. So it was very interesting to watch it this week and look at it in the context of subtext. So next week, I'm going to go into greater detail about what subtext is and how to spot it. And I'll do more of that and covering and talking about that throughout this season. So this week, I'll give a broad definition and I'll put some examples of subtext from Home Alone that's intentional and some of the subtext that's not. So I'll put that forward and see what people think. So what do I mean by subtext? Well, text is words and actions. Subtext is the meaning beneath the words, and it is the associations with the dialogues and the images and what the actions actually mean. So another way to describe it is subtext is a literary technique that can be used to convey thoughts, feelings, and ideas without overly stating them. So this is a massive topic and one that reaches into most areas of storytelling. In fact, I actually think now that it's a fundamental concept that all writers must understand. It's foundational, in my opinion. And already I've had a few aha moments while researching this topic and watching this movie. So Home Alone is not an overly complex movie, but it's pretty straightforward in terms of we get what we expect to see, but there is still a lot of subtext at play. So a very simple example is in the opening scenes. So the music by John Williams is like the Nutcracker Suite. So it sounds very similar to some of the parts of the Nutcracker Suite, which is a traditional Christmas classical music piece. And there is a full moon that is partially covered by clouds. Now, the Nutcracker, as I mentioned, is a Christmas story, and the full moon is associated with seeing at night and lunacy, and it's also could be seen as a bad omen. So the opening is signalling to the audience. So we already have the time of the year, which is synonymous with family and sharing and being together, and we have some foreboding with the clouded full moon. The next scene opens with a full shot of the house. There are lights and snow and a wreath on the door and American accents. So it is definitely Christmas in the Northern Hemisphere. So the house is lit up inside and out. There are people there and the voices overlay on this frame. It's busy and it's noisy, and it's also a large house. So we are 1 minute and 30 seconds into the film, and we already know a great deal about what's going on and where the action is going to take place. And a word has not been spoken. Next, we hear the word suitcase, and there's the sense of chaos we get when we're watching this large family or two families walk past a stranger in their foyer. Yes, he's dressed as a policeman, but he's ignored even though he's trying to get everyone's attention. All of this is setting up for when Kevin gets left behind, so we are not surprised, even when the characters realise what's happened. There are more and more incidents that lead to the crisis point in the beginning hook, but the key concept is right there at the beginning of the movie while we're looking at the subtext. So I'm going to put forward a bit of an idea that I'm coming up with as I've even in this first episode. So I have started to think that setups start as subtext. The symbols, items, or actions used in setups are not overt, they are implicit, but when the setups are paid off, they moved into the text, so they become explicit, and payoffs are text, whereas setups are subtext. So another setup occurs when the pizza boy arrives and the policeman opens the door. The pizza dude says, "Are you just around for the holidays?" And Harry, dressed as a policeman, responds, "I guess you could say that." Now, Harry's response is combined with the small growl that he's given to the little kids prior to answering the door, and it starts to pose questions about what he's doing there. This signals to the audience that something is up with Harry. So the narrative drive kicks into gear here because the audience wants to know, who is this policeman and what is he doing in the foyer of the house? The audience is also wondering, why are these people so preoccupied that they don't even notice a very obvious out-of-place person in their house? So again, none of this has been stated overtly. However, the audience is attuned to sense the messages transmitted by this time of the year. There's the music, the odd behaviour in the house, and Harry's short but unusual response. He's a policeman, so we assume he's there for a legitimate reason. That's what uniforms do, don't they? They tell us and they give people legitimacy. They tell us a lot without anyone having to explain. So the chaos of the house also explains, to a degree, why Kevin is left at home. Now, I'm not going to go through each scene and draw your attention to all the subtext because that would be hours and hours. But I'm going to use certain scenes to highlight techniques used to tell a story without giving meaning through the dialogue or the action. So the idea that setups are subtext and payoffs are text has quite blown me away this week. And I'll use another example of a scene where there are multiple setups are established. When Kevin first wakes up alone, he walks down to the basement or the cellar. The basement is dark and cluttered. There are weird things in the foreground, some sort of hanging bands, a mannequin, and a sewing machine. So the cellar and attics traditionally, or the meaning that they give us, are hiding places, usually for evil things and unwanted memories. They are often associated with secrets and evil. The music is stringy and uncomfortable. So this is spooky. And if you were a kid alone at home, you'd avoid this area of the house. Move forward 20 minutes and Kevin has used the stuff from the basement to create the illusion that there are people in the home at night, which turns Harry and Marv off breaking in that evening. The stuff in the basement, which contributed to the creepy feeling or atmosphere, has been paid off when Kevin creates the illusion of a full house. So once you start to notice these things, they become easier to see. Look at the setups and the payoffs. See how storytellers use subtext or plant things there for us to see but not understand, and then notice how those things move into the main narrative or become obvious and are paid off.
Can I jump in here for a minute?
Yeah.
I really like this idea that setups, what did you say? Setups
Subtext.
Start
Yeah.
as subtext.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, to me, subtext was the meaning beneath the text. So not quite a double entendre, because that's a different thing. But I had focused on the spoken word, subtext as being attached to the spoken word. And yes, dialogue can set up something that comes later. And I did notice that, for example, all the stuff in the basement and basements and attics being like sort of creepy places. And I did notice that. I had never connected it in any way as subtext. Like I just never ever made the connection between the two before. So I'm very curious to hear what you have to say about all of the other movies that we look at this season, because I really want to learn more about that.
Yeah, and I have taken I've used it in a very broad way this season, or I'm planning to. So it's interesting. And that's why I think when you look at it, like even the furnace down in the basement, the fact that it's in the basement and it looks like a monster is subtext. It's, and Kevin is scared. And that also adds to and sets up some of that maturation arc, right? So it's putting the tent pegs in for us then to go later and see how much he's grown. And so all of that is used without explicitly stating, I'm scared of the furnace. Do you know what I mean? And it's in the basement. And so because basements are associated with hiding and dark places and things like that, then it layers that storytelling. And so I'm finding it really fascinating too. And I'm not sure I'm going to cover off everything that subtext, where there's subtext this season. I might need to come back to it at some stage in a later season. And like I said, subtext is bigger than setups and payoffs, and it's a massive part of storytelling. And like I just said, I'll explore as many aspects of this as I can this season. So it operates at the micro level, like the example I've just provided, but it also operates at the macro level. So stories have messages. Sometimes they are intended and sometimes they are unintended. So as an example of an intended theme or message we can take away from Home Alone, it's that kids are far more resilient and resourceful than they are given credit for. Everyone in Kevin's family thinks he's helpless and incompetent. He is 8 and the youngest of 5 children. This also tells us a lot about Kevin and his role or place in the family. If Kevin had been the eldest in the family, would it have made a difference to how the audience reacts to his plight? Probably, and maybe, but Kevin is the baby in his family, and this is significant. This is subtext at work again. Very generally, we've been told by the other kids how helpless Kevin is, and he confirms this with his behaviour at the beginning of the movie. And we see how Kevin becomes capable when his survival depends on it. That is one of the messages we see in the subtext of the movie. It also happens to be Kevin's maturation arc. The 2 other messages contained in the movie may not be as intended, and there are many, but I'll focus on these 2. And these messages are implicit via the appearance, actions, and motivations of the supporting cast, especially Kate, Kevin's mother, and Peter, Kevin's father. So watch what Kate is doing and what she's wearing at the beginning of the movie. She is dressed in a smart suit, so it implies that she is a professional of some sort, and she is distracted on the phone when we meet her. Who checks that the kids have been counted when the family starts to go to the airport? It's Kate. Who is the one that has the feeling they've left something behind and realises that Kevin isn't with them? It's Kate. Who asks, what sort of parent, or she actually says, what sort of mother am I? So it's Kate. Who contacts the police, travels back to the US via all sorts of means to get to Kevin? It's Kate. And who is the only person who says sorry to Kevin? It's Kate. So what role does Peter, Kevin's father, play in trying to make sure Kevin is okay? Oh, he gets back at the same time as Kate and then says, oh, we took the morning flight, the one that you didn't want to wait for. So Peter is the cool, calm and collected one who waited and still got home at the same time. So this movie tells us a lot about who takes the blame for leaving an 8-year-old at home while they go on an overseas holiday. So what can we learn from this? Well, look at who's taking action and what sort of action it is, and then who isn't taking action. Do the characters in your story rely on tropes and stereotypes, or do they reflect on a bias that you may not have or be aware of? So they are some of the subtext things that I've, very quickly drawn out of Home Alone. And it was, when I sat down and thought about it, it was very rich in subtext. And I'm really looking forward to studying that this season. Valerie, what action steps do you have for us this week?
All right, so here's what I want you to do. Look at the middle build of your story and determine how many parts you're going to break it into. Then I want you to make sure that each part of the middle escalates the stakes and increases the tension in your story.
Right, so that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss Coraline. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For even more information about putting story theory into practice, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to find more out about me, visit melaniehill.com.au or visit me on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram under Melanie Hill Author. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.